Early in the morning there was some sharp firing at many points along the line, where daylight brought into view troops and skirmishers which had been posted after dark, and in accordance with Smith's instructions, 4 of Longstreet's brigades, Pickett's, Wilcox's, Pryor's and Colston's, and 2 of Huger's, Mahone's and Armistead's, advanced upon the enemy's position, which ran largely through the woods. There resulted a number of more or less severe affairs at different points, which were waged with varying fortunes for some hours. The brigades which had been engaged the day before were held in reserve near the captured redoubt. Meanwhile, with daylight, the enemy's position of the afternoon before, opposite Whiting, showed itself strengthened by entrenchments, and Smith thought there was evidence of additional reinforcements being sent from the north side. So the battle in Whiting's front was not renewed. Longstreet, too, soon began to call for reinforcements. The following notes were received from him in quick succession. June 1st. Yours of today received. The entire army seems to be opposed to me. I trust that some diversion may be made in my favour during these attacks, else my troops cannot stand it. The ammunition gives out too easily. 10 a.m. June 4. Can you reinforce me? The entire army seems to be opposed to me. We cannot hold out unless we get help. If we can fight together, we can finish the work today and Mac's time will be up. If I can't get help, I fear that I must fall back. On receipt of these notes, Smith ordered 5,000 men to be withdrawn from Magruder's force along the Chickahominy, above New Bridge, and sent to Longstreet, but meanwhile D.H. Hill, seeing that the fighting was accomplishing nothing, sent orders withdrawing the troops to the line of the night before. This was done rapidly at some points, and more slowly at others, but the enemy made no marked advance, and the action soon died out, it being now about 11 a.m. About 1:30 p.m., President Davis arrived at Smith's headquarters and informed him that Lee had been assigned to the command of the army, and Lee himself soon arrived. The party then rode over to Hill's position, whence Magruder's troops, which had arrived, were ordered back to the Chickahominy. After dark, orders were received by Hill from Longstreet for all troops to return to their camps within the Confederate lines. In his official report, Hill says, "The 13 brigades were not got together until near midnight. We regained our own entrenchments near sunrise." The moon that night was about 5 days old. The official reports do not show separately the casualties either of this last action or of Hill's battle on the 31st, though those of Johnston's battle are given by both sides. But Kearny's division and some of Longstreet's brigades were engaged both on the 31st and the 1st, and on the latter day, 2 of Huger's. The totals of the whole affair, as nearly as can be estimated, are shown in the following table, averaging where exact figures are wanting. A glance at this table suggests at once the weakness of our army. 3 separate times we advanced to give offensive battle, expecting to meet and to crush 2 Federal corps, which we knew would average over 15,000 men each. We had about 50,000 men to do it with, and it was necessary to do it quickly when once begun, for 3 other Federal corps were close at hand. On neither of the 3 occasions did we succeed in getting over about 14,000 men into action at all. The fighting qualities of the troops engaged proved excellent, but the trouble was in our organization, which could not handle the available force effectively. That was due partly to our lack of staff officers trained to military routine, partly to the unwieldy structure of our army into large divisions instead of into corps, and partly to the personal peculiarities of our commander, whose impatience of detail appears in the misunderstanding between himself and Longstreet, and in the lack of written orders to officers charged with carrying into effect important plans. Perhaps our greatest deficiency at this period was in the artillery service. None of our batteries were combined into battalions, but each infantry brigade had a battery attached to it. There were no field officers of artillery, charged with combining batteries and massing them to concentrate heavy fire upon important points. There was never greater need or better opportunity for this than in Johnston's battle of the 31st. The enemy had but 2 batteries, Kirby's and Brady's, and no more were available. They did not receive a single hostile cannon shot, and were able to devote their whole fire to our infantry lines, which in every case seemed to be finally repulsed only by heavy canister at close quarters. We had no lack of batteries. The roads were full of them, but there was no organisation to make them effective. Both roads and open fields were in very miry condition, and all movements would have been slow, but a competent officer by doubling teams could have brought up guns with little delay. The opportunity to place Lee in command of the army was a very gratifying one to President Davis, and it increased our chances of success to have cordial relations established between the War Department, under the Chief Executive, and the Army under its commander. Relations had not been cordial before, and at this particular time the strain upon them was being increased daily by Davis's feeling that he was not being taken into Johnston's confidence as to his plans. In Volume 2 of his Rise and Fall of the Confederacy, Davis writes of this period as follows: "Seeing no preparation to keep the enemy at a distance, and kept in ignorance of any plan for such purpose, I sent for General Lee, then at Richmond in general charge of army operations, and told him why and how I was dissatisfied with the condition of affairs. He asked me what I thought it was proper to do. I answered that McClellan should be attacked on the other side of the Chickahominy before he matured his preparations for a siege of Richmond. To this he promptly assented, as I anticipated he would, for I knew it had been his own opinion. He then said, 'General Johnston should, of course, advise you of what he expects or proposes to do. Let me go and see him, and defer this discussion until I return.' No date is given, but in the war records the following letter from Lee to Johnston appears, and it was probably the result of this conversation, May 24, 1862, Wednesday. General Joseph E. Johnston. General, the President desires to know the number of troops around Richmond, how they are posted, and the organization of the divisions and brigades, also the program of operations which you propose. The information relative to the composition and position of your army can readily be furnished, but your plan of operations, dependent upon circumstances perhaps yet to be developed, may not be so easily explained, nor may it be prudent to commit it to paper. I would, therefore, respectfully suggest that you communicate your views on this subject personally to the President, which perhaps would be more convenient to you and satisfactory to him. I am, etc. R. E. Lee, General. The war records follow this letter with a statement of the Army's complete organisation and its strength, 53,688, but there is nowhere record of any other reply. From Mr. Davis's narrative, it is clear that no further communication took place. The narrative goes on. When General Lee came back, he told me that General Johnston proposed on the next Thursday to move against the enemy as follows. General A. P. Hill was to move down the right flank and rear of the enemy. General G. W. Smith, as soon as Hill's guns opened, was to cross the Chickahominy at the Meadow Bridge, attack the enemy in flank, and by the conjunction of the two it was expected to double him up. Then Longstreet was to cross on the Mechanicsville Bridge and attack him in front. From this plan, the best results were hoped for by both of us. The next Thursday was May 29th. In the records appear no signs of battle until May 27th. On that day came news that McDowell was starting south from Fredericksburg. Johnston immediately ordered troops into position for the attack at dawn on the 29th. But, as has been told, on the 28th he received news of McDowell's recall north. That night he countermanded the battle orders and had the troops withdrawn under cover of darkness from all advanced positions. The President's narrative goes on. On the morning of the day proposed, I hastily dispatched my office business and rode out toward the Meadow Bridge to see the action commence. On the road I found Smith's division halted and the men dispersed in the woods. Looking for someone from whom I could get information, I finally saw General Hood and asked him the meaning of what I saw. He told me that he did not know anything more than that they had been halted. Riding onto the main road, which led to the Mechanicsville Bridge, I found General Longstreet walking to and fro in an impatient, it might be said, fretful manner. Before speaking to him, he said his division had been under arms all day, waiting for orders to advance, and that the day was now so far spent that he did not know what was the matter. Thus ended the offensive-defensive programme from which Lee expected much and of which I was hopeful. But 2 days afterward, May 31st, the President rode out again late in the afternoon, and when on the 9-mile road, heard firing in the direction of 7 Pines. Mr. Davis writes, "As I drew nearer, I saw General Whiting with part of General Smith's division file into the road in front of me. At the same time, I saw General Johnston ride across the field from a house before which General Lee's horse was standing. I turned down to the house and asked General Lee what the musketry firing meant. He replied by asking whether I had heard it, and being answered in the affirmative, he said he had been under that impression himself, but General Johnston had assured him that it could be nothing more than an artillery duel. It is scarcely necessary to add that neither of us had been advised of a design to attack the enemy that day." It seems clear from this narrative that General Johnston entirely disregarded the letter of May 21st, so far as it required him to acquaint the President with his proposed programme of operations. The verbal message conveyed by Lee that he proposed to attack north of the Chickahominy on the 29th may serve to acquit him of literal disobedience, but the change of programme was neither notified beforehand or explained afterward, nor was any notice given of the attack at 7 Pines on the 31st, although there was ample opportunity to do so. It is not probable, however, that Johnston intended his course to be one either of disrespect or disobedience. It had its source, doubtless, in his aversion to detail, or to committing himself as to what he proposed to do when he was fighting a superior force and was really waiting for opportunities to turn up. It must be admitted that at 7 Pines our prospects, had Johnston not been wounded, would have been dismal. Besides the lack of cordial relations between the President and Johnston, the latter's effort to handle the army in battle had been an utter failure. His orders were given, he says, for the concentration of 23 of our 27 brigades against McClellan's left wing. Yet nowhere were ever over 4 brigades in action at one time. No complaint is made of any disobedience, slowness, or non-performance by any officer except Huger, and the facts in his case distinctly relieve him from any blame whatever. Indeed, it is almost tragic the way in which he became the scapegoat of this occasion, the true history of which is even yet not generally understood. General Smith, however, in 1891 published all the facts for the first time, with documentary proof. Son Rains was a graduate of West Point of class of 1827 and was now 79 years of age. He had had some Indian fighting in Florida and had been wounded, but he was not in the Mexican War. He was an expert and enthusiast upon explosives, and soon after the action at 7 Pines, he was relieved of his brigade and assigned to the Torpedo Bureau, which was organized for submarine defense of our rivers and harbors. This includes 12 killed, 45 wounded, 12 missing, total 69, which occurred in Johnston's battle on the left. This omits Kemper, who was not seriously engaged. 1. Such phenomena, called acoustic shadows, are of common occurrence and are to be expected upon every battlefield in some direction, especially in wooded localities. Here the intervening ground was moderately wooded. The artillery could be distinguished, but the amount of it was not great. 1. Among the staff officers who saw this incident, it was believed that General Johnston saw Mr. Davis approaching, and that he sought to avoid a meeting by mounting quickly and riding rapidly to the extreme front, where he remained until he received his wounds. I was a witness of the scene. Chapter 6. Jackson's Valley Campaign. Before taking up the history of affairs before Richmond in June 1862, with Lee at the head of the army, it is necessary to review events in the Valley of Virginia. This valley constituted the only route by which a Confederate army could invade Maryland and threaten Washington City in the rear. Cool judgment at the head of affairs, after Washington had once been fortified against an attack by open assault, might have laughed at any idea of real danger from such an invasion. It should have been clear to all that no invasion could maintain itself long enough to carry on a siege or to do more than to fight one great battle. The trouble was the lack of railroad transportation. Wagons alone would have to be relied upon to bring all supplies from Staunton Bay, a distance via the valley roads of nearly 200 miles to Washington. But fear, approaching panic, took possession of Washington whenever a Confederate force appeared in the valley, and every other operation would be suspended to concentrate all efforts upon driving it out. This oversensitiveness of the Federals cut its greatest figure in 1862, and was, more than once, the only salvation of Richmond. For the Confederate generals understood it, and as the situation in front of Richmond became more threatening, they sought more earnestly to reinforce the valley. It happened that Stonewall Jackson had been assigned as the commander of the Valley District in November 1861, and the reader has already been told of the Battle of Kernstown, which he fought there on March 23, 1862. After that battle, he had fallen back with his division, about 8,000 strong, to Swift Run Gap. Ewell, with about as many more, was at Gordonsville, and Edward Johnson, with about 3,000, was near Staunton. The Federals had made in West Virginia 2 separate departments. That off the Shenandoah, under Banks, included the valley in which Banks had, in April, about 19,000 men near Harrisonburg. About 40 miles west in the mountains was Fremont, commanding what was called the Mountain Department, in which he had about 15,000 men. About 3,700 of these, under Milroy, were at McDowell, a point 25 miles west of Staunton. On April 29th, Jackson proposed to Lee in Richmond that he, Jackson, should unite his own force and Johnston's and attack Milroy and Fremont and drive them back into the mountains. Then, returning quickly and being joined by Ewell, his whole force should fall upon Banks. Lee approved the project and committed its entire execution to Jackson. Ewell's division was brought up to Swift Run Gap to observe Banks, while Jackson concealed his object by marching his own division back across the Blue Ridge toward Charlottesville and moving from a railroad station near Charlottesville by rail to Staunton. Here he united with Johnson and marched rapidly upon Milroy. He had started on April 30th, and taking a country road, had been 3 days in moving his guns and trains through 12 miles of mud to reach a metalled road. He had intended to rest over Sunday, May 4th, but news of Fremont's cavalry having advanced induced him reluctantly to put his infantry upon the cars and move to Staunton on that day. On May 7th he left Staunton, and on May 8th he confronted Milroy at McDowell. Milroy had been reinforced by Schenk's brigade. Jackson kept most of his force concealed, and about 2,500 Federals were advanced against him in the afternoon. A sharp affair ensued with about 2,800 of Jackson's force holding the crest of a steep ridge more exposed to fire than was the enemy. The latter only lost about 250 killed and wounded, while the Confederates lost 498. But the next morning the Federals had retreated. Jackson pursued for 2 or 3 days, going nearly to Franklin, and then on May 12th turned back, damaging and obstructing all roads behind him, and thus practically neutralizing for a while Fremont's whole force. He now marched to unite with Ewell and to strike at Banks. Friday, May 16th, had been appointed by the Confederate President a day of fasting and prayer, and it was spent in camp at Lebanon Springs near Staunton. Meanwhile, during Jackson's absence, the situation in the valley had changed. Shields's division, about 9,000 men, had been taken from Banks and ordered to join McDowell at Fredericksburg, where the latter would await it before advancing to join McClellan before Richmond. This reduced Banks's force to about 10,000, and he had been withdrawn down the valley to Strasburg, which he was ordered to fortify and hold. Jackson now had, with Ewell's division, about 16,000 men. On May 20th he arrived at New Market, whence there were 2 roads to Winchester. The western, the most direct and shortest, going by Strasburg, and the eastern, crossing the Massanutten Mountains to Luray, followed the valley of the South Fork of the Shenandoah to Front Royal, about 12 miles east of Strasburg. Then, crossing the river, it united with the direct road at Newtown, within 12 miles of Winchester. His march was by the eastern route and was conducted with such secrecy that the enemy had no idea that he was within 60 miles when, at 1 p.m. on May 23, his skirmishers attacked a Federal outpost at Front Royal held by Colonel Kenly with about 1,000 men and 2 guns. Kenly, seeing a much superior force, set fire to his camp and, crossing the Shenandoah, also set fire to the bridge behind him, but Jackson's men rushed in and saved it, though so damaged as to make the use of it slow and difficult. Jackson, crossing at a ford with the 6th Vache Cav, under Coles Flournoy, charged the enemy, capturing the 2 guns and 600 prisoners, the enemy losing 154 killed and wounded, and the Confederates only 26. Even a more brilliant success might have resulted here, but for an unfortunate failure of our staff service, as follows. As he approached Front Royal from the south, about 3.5 miles from the town, a rough country road diverged to the east and gave a second approach to the town by an obscure route of about 8 miles over some steep hills. The more surely to avoid the enemy's pickets and to execute a surprise, Jackson had taken the head of his column by this road. But after striking the enemy's pickets near Front Royal, he sent back orders for the rear brigades to follow the short and nearly level highway to the town. As usual at that time in the Confederate armies, the courier service was performed by a small detachment of cavalry, temporarily detailed, not by specially selected men, as was later practiced. In this case, the courier selected to carry the order not only failed to deliver it, but took himself off and was never heard of again. It resulted that Jackson waited in vain the whole afternoon for the coming up of most of his artillery and infantry. Part of it only arrived after dark, completely exhausted by its laborious march, and one of his brigades, tired out, encamped 4 miles short of Front Royal. The cream of the whole occasion was thus lost. Banks did not appreciate the situation until the next morning, and only toward 10 o'clock did he get off from Strasburg in retreat for Winchester. Jackson, too, was able to make only a late start, and being delayed by forces sent out by Banks to protect his right flank, he missed by 2 hours, intercepting Banks's infantry, though he captured and destroyed about 100 wagons and took some prisoners. There was much delay also from poor discipline in both the Confederate infantry and cavalry, especially in the latter. It was not easy for either to resist the temptations offered by so many wagons loaded with articles of food and clothing, calculated to appeal strongly to Confederate wants. But if time was thus wasted, Jackson made it up by pushing his march for the greater part of the night. It was 3 a.m. when he finally allowed his exhausted men to lie down and sleep, and they were now near enough to Winchester to make it sure that Banks could not get away without a battle. Early in the morning, Jackson attacked Winchester. The enemy made a stubborn resistance, having good position but an inferior force. He was finally, however, broken and driven from the town in great confusion. Jackson, in his official report, says of the occasion, "Never have I seen an opportunity when it was in the power of cavalry to reap a richer harvest of the fruits of victory. Hoping that the cavalry would soon come up, the artillery, followed by infantry, was pressed forward for about 2 hours for the purpose of preventing by artillery fire a reforming of the enemy. But as nothing was heard of the cavalry, and as but little or nothing could be accomplished without it in the exhausted condition of our infantry, between which and the enemy the distance was constantly increasing, I ordered a halt and issued orders for going into camp and refreshing the men." This had been the critical moment of Jackson's whole strategic movement. He had successfully concentrated a superior force upon his enemy and routed him, and needed but his cavalry to reap the full fruits of a great success. He had 3 regiments of cavalry, the 7th under Colin Turner Ashby and the Soudian 6th, which the day before had been placed under the command of General G.O.H. Stewart. Ashby's regiment was recruited in the valley and was noted for every good quality except discipline. Being near their homes, the opportunity to loot the captured trains had been peculiarly seductive, and the regiment for some days was but little more than a company. With his small force remaining, Ashby, unfortunately the night before, had ridden to Berryville, fearing the enemy might attempt to escape by Snicker's Gap. The Sud and 6th Regiments under Stuart were with Ewell's troops on the right of the attack, Jackson being with the left. There was no reason, therefore, except our fatal facility of blundering, why these two regiments should not have been promptly at hand, and for once the spectacle be seen of a Confederate army reaping the fruits of victory. The story is a curious one, and is told in Jackson's official report as follows. I had seen but some 50 of Ashby's cavalry since prior to the pillaging scenes of the previous evening, and none since an early hour of the past night. The Sud and 6th Verso regiments of cavalry were under the command of Brig General Geo. H. Stuart of Ewell's command. After the pursuit had been continued for some distance beyond the town, and seeing nothing of the cavalry, I dispatched my aide-de-camp, Lieutenant Pendleton, to General Stuart with an order to move as rapidly as possible, and join me on the Martinsburg turnpike and carry on the pursuit of the enemy with vigour. His reply was that he was under the command of General Ewell and the order must come through him. Such conduct and consequent delay has induced me to require of Lieutenant, now Magruder, Pendleton, a full statement of the case, which is forwarded herewith. Pendleton tells how Stuart, who was a graduate of West Point and an officer of the old army, had refused and failed to obey Jackson's order for immediate action because not given through a division commander. General Jackson then goes on to say, about an hour after the halt of the main body had been ordered, Brig. General Geo. H. Stuart, with his cavalry, came up, and renewing the pursuit pushed forward in a highly creditable manner, and succeeded in capturing a number of prisoners. But the main body of Banks's army was now beyond the reach of successful pursuit, and effected its escape across the Potomac. Before reaching Bunker Hill, General Stuart was joined by General Ashby with a small portion of his cavalry. Upon my inquiring of General Ashby why he was not where I desired him at the close of the engagement, he stated that he had moved to the enemy's left for the purpose of cutting off a portion of his force. General Stuart pushed on to Martinsburg, where he captured a large amount of army stores. There is good reason for believing that had the cavalry played its part in this pursuit, as well as the 4 companies had done under Colonel Flournoy 2 days before in the pursuit from Front Royal, but a small portion of Banks's army would have made its escape to the Potomac. This narrative shows how our efficiency was impaired by our deficiencies of discipline. Our strategy, marching and fighting had all been excellent. Yet, owing to the failure of one courier, and a single mistake of narrow-mindedness in a general, Banks had escaped with but trifling loss of men or material. The campaign, however, had not been undertaken to capture men or material. Its great object was to break up McDowell's proposed march from Fredericksburg to reinforce McClellan in front of Richmond. This, it will be seen, was fully accomplished by the help of the following chapter of accidents, and just at the critical moment. McDowell had been ordered to march as soon as he was joined by Shields's division. It arrived on May 22nd. Only 1 day was needed to equip it for the march to Richmond, but the loss of 3 days followed. Its artillery ammunition had been condemned by an inspector, and a 2nd day was lost, waiting for ammunition which had been delayed by the grounding of a schooner near Alexandria. Everything, however, was ready by the night of the 24th, and McDowell was anxious to march on Sunday, the 25th. But a 3rd day's delay now ensued from Mr. Lincoln's superstitious feeling that his chances of success might be improved by showing some special regard for the Sabbath. McDowell's official report says, I was now ready to march with over 40,000 men and over 100 pieces of artillery. Though I could have started, and would have started, Sunday, yet it was resolved not to march till Monday. This out of deference to the wishes of the President, who was with me at the time, having come down Friday night, and with the concurrence of the Secretary of War on account of the day. When it is remembered that the distance to unite with McClellan could have been easily covered within 3 marches, one is impressed with the influence of small events upon great matters, especially when the small events involve the loss of time, even of hours. It has already been told how McDowell did actually start, but having made only a part of a day's march, he was recalled and sent after Jackson. Had he made even a full day, it is very doubtful if he would have been recalled. On the morning of Sunday, the 25th, everything in Washington was serene. Those best posted and in highest authority confidently expected the early fall of Richmond, and had good reason for their expectations indeed. The New York Herald that morning had a leader headed, "Fall of Richmond." By noon, the papers were issuing extras headed, "Defeat of Banks, Washington in Danger." A volcanic eruption could scarcely have startled the administration more. Telegrams were sent to the governors of a dozen states calling for instant help to save the capital. Reinforcements were rushed to Williamsport and Harper's Ferry to assist Banks. McDowell's march, already begun before orders could reach it, was countermanded, and half his force, under Shields and Ord, was hurried to the valley to attack Jackson from the east, while Fremont's 15,000 attacked from the west. McDowell, who was a good soldier, appreciated that no force possible for Jackson to have collected could accomplish any serious results, and remonstrated and begged in vain to be allowed to carry out his projected march upon Richmond. When this was refused, he suggested that he be directed upon Gordonsville, but this too was overruled, and Shields and Ord were directed to march upon Strasburg, toward which point also Fremont was approaching. Meanwhile, Jackson, having gone into camp about noon on Sunday, the 25th, when his infantry and artillery could no longer pursue the enemy, felt moved, even as Lincoln had done, to recognize the Sabbath by making up for the services missed in the morning. His official report says, "On the following day, the 26th, divine service was held for the purpose of rendering thanks to God for the success with which he had blessed our arms, and to implore his continued favour." During the next 2 or 3 days he made demonstrations toward the Potomac, advancing his troops to Charlestown, and within 2 miles of Harper's Ferry, but these demonstrations were only for their moral effect at the north, and to occupy time while he filled his wagons with captured stores and prepared a convoy of a double line of wagons near 7 miles long and about 2,300 prisoners. Only on the 30th did he put his columns in motion toward the rear. Had his opponents acted boldly and swiftly, their positions would now have enabled them to cut off Jackson's retreat and to overwhelm him. But the moral effect of his reputation doubtless caused some hesitation, and Jackson's entire force and his whole convoy, with some skirmishing at Front Royal with Shields and at Wardensville with Fremont, passed between his converging foes at Strasburg on the 31st, a portion of one of his brigades making in one day a march of 36 miles. Besides the prisoners and stores brought off, Jackson left about 700 Federals sick and wounded at Winchester, and burned many stores for which he had no transportation. 2 guns and over 9,000 muskets were saved. After passing Strasburg on the 31st, the race was continued up the main Shenandoah Valley, with Jackson leading and Fremont following in his tracks, while Shields advanced up the Luray Valley on the east. At Newmarket, the road from Luray enters the valley through Massanutten Gap, but Jackson had sent cavalry ahead who burned the bridges by which Shields might have had access. At Conrad's Store, another bridge across the South Fork gave a road to Harrisonburg, and Shields rushed his cavalry ahead to gain possession of it, but again he was too late. Meanwhile, there had been a severe rainstorm on June 2nd, and though Shields could hear the guns of Jackson's rearguard and Fremont's advance on the other side of the Massanutten Mountains, he was powerless to cross. On Thursday, June 5th, Jackson reached Harrisonburg, and here diverged east to cross the South Fork upon the bridge at Port Republic. On the 6th, in a severe cavalry affair of the rearguard, General Turner Ashby was killed. Of the civilian soldiers whom the war produced, such as Forrest, Morgan, and others, scarcely one gave such early and marked indication of rare military genius as Ashby. On the 7th, Jackson's advance at night reached the vicinity of Port Republic. This village is situated in the angle between the North and South Rivers, which here unite and form the South Fork of the Shenandoah. The North River is the larger of the two, and the road from Harrisonburg crosses it by a wooden bridge. The South River was fordable. On the morning of Sunday the 8th, Jackson had sent 2 companies of cavalry across the river to scout on the Luray Road toward Shields's advance. About 8 a.m., these companies were driven back in a rout and followed into the village by a body of Federal cavalry, who, with 4 guns and a brigade of infantry following, formed Shields's advance. Jackson himself was in the village and narrowly escaped capture, riding across the bridge over the North River. 3 of his staff were captured but afterward escaped. 3 brigades of infantry, however, and 3 batteries were near at hand, and the Federals were soon brought under a fire that sent them back in confusion with a loss of about 40 men and 2 guns, which had been brought across the South River. As their leading brigade, Carroll's, fell back, it met a 2nd brigade of Shields's division, Tyler's, with artillery, and the 2 brigades, selecting a position about 2 miles north, decided to await the arrival of Shields with the rest of the division. Jackson left 2 brigades to protect the bridge, and with the remainder of his force marched back about 4 miles to Cross Keys, where he had left Ewell's division holding a selected position against Fremont. Fremont was now in reach of Jackson, and by all the maxims of war should have exerted his utmost strength to crush him. He could afford to risk fighting his last reserves, and even to wreck his army, if he might thereby detain or cripple Jackson, for other armies were coming to his help and were near at hand. His attack, however, was weak. He had about 10,000 infantry, 2,000 cavalry, and 12 batteries. Ewell had at first but 6,000 infantry and 500 cavalry. Fremont brought into play about all of his artillery, but he advanced only 1 brigade of infantry from his left flank. This was repulsed and followed, and the whole of Fremont's left wing driven back to the shelter of his line of guns. Elsewhere there was no more than skirmishing and artillery duelling, of which the Federals usually had the best with their superior metal and ammunition. It was Jackson's role to fight only defensive battles, until he had shaken off the superior force which beset him, so the battle lingered along all day, the casualties being. During the night of the 8th, Jackson returned to Port Republic and improvised a footbridge to carry his infantry dry-shod across the South River. Early next morning, leaving a rearguard of 2 brigades under Trimble and Patton to delay Fremont, the rest of his force was put in motion to find and attack Shields's 2 brigades, which had unwisely halted about 2 miles from Port Republic the day before. I say unwisely because they were only about 4,000 men and 16 guns, but they had a position so beautiful that they were excusable just for the chance of fighting from it. From the river on the right it extended straight across a mile of open plain, along a hollow road running between good banks, strongly fenced, to a considerable ravine in the wooded foothills of the Blue Ridge. The key of the position was a high retired shoulder on the Federal left, on which were posted 7 guns, strongly supported by infantry sheltered in the nearby wood, and commanding every foot of the plain. Jackson, this morning, proposed to himself a double victory, and he built the footbridge across the South River to enable him to win it. He intended, by making a very early start, to fall upon Shields's 2 brigades and crush them, and then doubling back upon his track to recross the rivers and meet Fremont, whom he would expect to find advancing toward Port Republic against the opposition which Trimble and Patton would make. It was a good plan and entirely feasible, but 2 things went wrong in its execution. The first was with the footbridge over the South River. This was rudely constructed of a plank footway, supported upon the running gear of wagons standing in the stream, which was about breast deep. Such a bridge may be made quite serviceable, but this one was not strongly built, and before it had been in use long it became impassable, except in single file. This made the passage of each brigade over twice as long as it should have been. The second trouble was Jackson's impatience, which defeated his own purpose. Winder's brigade, leading his column, began to cross the bridge about 4:45 a.m., and Jackson was near the head of the column. When the enemy's position was discovered, it was plain that the key position above noted was its most assailable point. time and blood would both have been saved by bringing up at once a force amply sufficient to overwhelm it. As he had 5 brigades at hand and an abundance of artillery, there need have been no failure and no more delay than the time needed to bring up his troops. Going into battle before enough troops were brought up was sure to result in more or less disaster. Wender's brigade, about 1,500 strong, with 2 batteries, first attacked the Federal centre. It was not only badly repulsed, but the enemy gave a counterstroke, pursuing the fugitives and capturing a gun which they succeeded in carrying off. Other troops were arriving to reinforce Winder, but they were arriving too slowly. The Federal commander saw a chance to defeat his adversary by taking him in detail, and was swift to take advantage of it. He brought forward 2 fresh regiments from his left to reinforce an advance from his centre. In vain, Jackson himself rode among his own old brigade, exposing his life freely and endeavouring to rally them. Their thin lines had been for the time practically wrecked against superior numbers, in a position almost impregnable. Fortunately, at the critical moment, relief came suddenly. Jackson had recognised the key position held by the enemy's 7-gun battery early in the morning, and had directed Taylor's fine Louisiana brigade to attack it, and later sent a 2nd brigade to follow Taylor. Their approach was made through forest, and the enemy were unaware of it. Taylor urged his march to the utmost, and was admonished by the sounds of the battle in the open country on his left that his friends were in need of assistance. So, without waiting for the brigade which followed him, he broke cover and charged boldly on the Federal battery at just the critical moment for Jackson on the left. The sudden bursting out of so severe a battle at this vital point at once relieved the pressure upon Winder's centre. Taylor had a desperate fight, the battery being taken and retaken and taken again, before 6 of its guns and all of its caissons were finally held, and its fire opened upon the now retreating Federals. Taylor's brigade lost 288 men in this action, but accomplished its victory before the arrival of its support. It was now about 10:30 a.m. About 9, Jackson had realised that he would not be able to accomplish the double victory he had hoped for, and had sent word to Patton and Trimble to come across the bridges at Port Republic and to burn them. They had not been followed closely by Fremont. He only showed up on the opposite bank at noon, having had but 7 miles to come. He had a pontoon train, but made no effort to cross, and confined his activity to cannonading the Confederates from the north bank, wherever he could find an opportunity, during the whole afternoon. It accomplished little harm except to the Federal wounded, driving off the ambulances which were gathering them. Jackson pressed the retreat of Tyler's 2 brigades for about 9 miles down the river, capturing about 500. He then withdrew by roads which avoided Fremont's guns on the west bank, and went into camp between midnight and dawn on the 10th in Brown's Gap on the Blue Ridge, some of his regiments having marched over 20 miles. The casualties in this action were as follows, the Federals having but 2 brigades engaged, and the Confederates 4. The entire casualties for the whole campaign sum up as follows for the 2 armies. When, in his retreat, Jackson had gotten safely past Strasburg, the Federal War Department gave up all hope of capturing him and began to take measures to renew McDowell's advance upon Richmond. One of McDowell's divisions, McCall's, had been held at Fredericksburg, and about June 6th it had been sent by water to join McClellan upon the peninsula. On the 8th orders were sent for McDowell himself, with Shields's and Ord's divisions to march for Fredericksburg. But before these orders could have any effect, there came the news of Jackson's sharp counterstrokes at Cross Keys and Port Republic, which had the purely moral effect of causing the order to be countermanded. It remained countermanded, and McDowell and his 2 divisions were kept in the valley about Front Royal until June 20th. This delay took away his last possible chance to reinforce McClellan before Lee took the offensive. Indeed, the movement to Fredericksburg, resumed about June 20th, was stopped on June 26th by the formation of a new army to be commanded by General John Pope. It comprised the entire forces of Fremont, Banks, and McDowell, and was charged with the duty of overcoming the forces under Jackson. So we may now leave him and his gallant but wearied foot cavalry to enjoy about 5 days of rest on the banks of the Shenandoah, and take up the story of Lee before Richmond. The death of Ashby was a terrible blow to the Army of the Valley. From the outbreak of the war he had been employed on the Shenandoah, and from Staunton to the Potomac his was the most familiar figure in the Confederate ranks. His daring rides on his famous white charger were already the theme of song and story, and if the tale of his exploits, as told in camp and farm, sometimes bordered on the marvellous, the bare truth stripped of all exaggeration was sufficient in itself to make him a hero. His reckless courage, his fine horsemanship, his skill in handling his command, and his power of stimulating devotion were not the only attributes which incited admiration. With such qualities, it is said, were united the utmost generosity and unselfishness, and a delicacy of feeling equal to a woman's. Chapter 7. 7 Days' Campaign. The Attack. When General Lee, on June 1, 1862, took command of the Army of Northern Virginia, he brought with him his personal staff, Col. R. H. Chilton, Adjutant, Col. A. L. Long, Military Secretary and Maids, Taylor, Venable, Marshall, and Talcott's as aides. He retained the chiefs of all departments, Corley as quartermaster, Cole as commissary, Guild as medical director, and myself as ordnance officer, and all matters of routine went on as before. The chances of a successful campaign against McClellan had increased greatly when Johnston fell, wounded, as has been already told. Johnston had proposed the concentration at Richmond of a large force, to be drawn from points farther south. Lee would be able to bring this about more effectively, occupying, as he had done, the position of military adviser to the President. He had as yet never commanded an army, and his accession to his present command did not at once inspire popular enthusiasm. His only active service had been in West Virginia, where he was department commander in the fall of 1861. His campaign had generally been considered a failure, but should have been recognized as a success, for there had been at least no loss of men, nor any serious reverse. It was absurd for the Confederacy to seek to occupy so extensive and mountainous a country as West Virginia, so close to the great state of Ohio, and with a population strongly favoring the federal cause. It was impossible to supply our armies over their long and difficult roads. Mountain barriers in that section not only gave the country to the Federals, but proclaimed peace. This came to be recognized after one campaign. With this for a result, and no battles having been fought, an idea arose that Lee would not be an aggressive commander. This was strengthened when Lee's first care was to select a line of battle and begin to fortify it. To some of the amateur critics who wrote for the public press, this seemed little better than a confession of cowardice. The Richmond Examiner, edited by Pollard, was conspicuous in the bitterness of its attacks. Through some of these I chanced upon an interview which impressed me very forcibly at the time, and which proved to be quite a prophetic estimate of Lee as a commander. It came about as follows. On the staff of the President was Colonel Joseph C. Ives, a graduate of West Point in the class of '52. He was born in New York and appointed from Connecticut, but had married into the well-known Semmes family of Georgia and Alabama, and had joined his fortunes with the South. He served on the staff of President Davis during the whole of the war. While in no way conspicuous, he impressed all who met him as particularly intellectual and as an unusually accomplished officer. When Lee had been in command about 2 weeks, I had a long ride with Ives about our lines, one afternoon, during which he referred to these newspaper attacks and asked if I thought they in any way impaired the confidence of the army in Lee. I had seen no such effect, and told him so, and then went on to say, "Ives, tell me this. We are here fortifying our lines, but apparently leaving the enemy all the time he needs to accumulate his superior forces, and then to move on us in the way he thinks best. Has General Lee the audacity that is going to be required for our inferior force to meet the enemy's superior force, to take the aggressive, and to run risks and stand chances?" Ives's reply was so impressive, both in manner and matter, that it has always been remembered as vividly as if today. He reined up his horse, stopped in, the road, and turning to me, said, "Alexander, if there is one man in either army, Confederate or Federal, head and shoulders above every other in audacity, it is Jenner Lee. His name might be Audacity. He will take more desperate chances and take them quicker than any other general in this country, North or South, and you will live to see it too." It is needless to say that I did live to see it many times over, but it seems even yet a mystery how, at that time, Ives or President Davis or any other living man had divined it. No one could meet Lee and fail to be impressed with his dignity of character, his intellectual power, and his calm self-reliance. But all those qualities might be recognized without deducing from them, also the existence of such phenomenal audacity, except by an inspiration of genius. The principal feature of Lee's proposed plan had long been the bringing down of Jackson from the valley to attack the enemy's right wing. Even before Jackson had extricated himself from the pursuit of his enemies, on June 8th, Lee had written him to set on foot the arrangements to mislead the enemy as to his intentions. The arrangements adopted were both elaborate and effective. Not only were all sorts of exciting false rumours set on foot throughout the valley, but Whiting's division from before Richmond and Lawton's large brigade, arriving from Georgia nearly 4,000 strong, were sent by rail from Richmond to Staunton about June 11th to create the impression that Jackson's raid was about to be repeated with a much larger force. Meanwhile, Jackson's force was marched again to the Shenandoah near Port Republic about the 11th, after Shields and Fremont had fallen back to the neighborhood of Strasburg. Here Jackson took 5 days of rest preparatory to the movement upon Richmond. During most of this period, by all the rules of the game, McClellan was in default for not attacking. He had come within arm's length, but allowed the initiative to Lee. McDowell had been taken from him, so that he had nothing to gain by waiting, while his enemy had the opportunity both of reinforcement and of fortification. Lee was, indeed, doing his utmost in each direction. McClellan seemed to have been subconsciously aware that he ought to attack, and that his advantage was being lost by every day's delay. For his reports to Washington represented his army, from day to day, as being only held back from a general advance by waiting for some slight additional advantage which a day or two would bring. On June 2nd, which was his best opportunity, he was only waiting for the water to fall in the Chickahominy. On June 7th, he was waiting for McCall's division, about 10,000 strong, which arrived on the 12th and 13th. On June 16th, he was waiting for 2 days to let the ground harden. On June 18th, the general engagement might begin at any hour. On June 25th, the action will probably occur tomorrow or within a short time. And at last he was right, for Lee began it on the 26th, and during the interval, since June 2nd, the advantage had shied from McClellan's side to Lee's. As the game and the players now stood, the game was Lee's for. A great success, the greatest ever so fairly offered to any Confederate general. His strategy had been good and had been carried through without a flaw. Jackson's entire army, reinforced by Whiting's division and Lawton's brigade, had been brought down secretly from the valley, and, on the night of June 25th, was encamped at Ashland, within 13 miles of Mechanicsville. It was about 18,500 strong. Meanwhile, Lee had drawn together, available for battle, around Richmond about 65,000 other troops, and had fortified his lines on the southeast between the Chickahominy and the James, enough to make them quite secure with half his force. McClellan's right flank was but a single corps, Porter's not over 30,000 strong, and separated from the Federal centre by the Chickahominy River and about 4 miles of distance. Under these circumstances, with even fairly good tactics, Porter's corps should have been practically destroyed, and with it the Federal line of supply from the York River. That once accomplished, the capture or destruction of the remainder of McClellan's army during their retreat to the James River would have been an easier task than the first. All this was in the game which Lee set out to play on June 26th, and the stakes were already his if his execution were even half as good as his plan. At the beginning there was every promise that it would be. 2 days before, a confidential order had been issued to general officers and heads of departments, which is given in part in contrast with Johnston's method, as developed at Seven Pines. But one grave error had been committed. Among the preparations which Lee had made for the occasion had been a forced reconnaissance of the enemy's rear, which was made by his cavalry commander Stuart between June 11th and 15. Stuart, with about 1,200 men and 2 guns, passing well behind the enemy's right, had gotten into his rear and discovered that his right flank did not extend for any distance northward from the Chickahominy and rested on no natural obstacle. But the expedition could not safely return, Stuart thought, by the route taken in going. He determined, therefore, to make the circuit of the Federal army, crossing the Chickahominy below by a bridge which he expected to find. In this he was disappointed, but with great resource he got safely across, partly by swimming and partly by rebuilding a bridge, and brought off his guns and a few prisoners. But this raid, though ordered by Lee and handsomely conducted, had one unfortunate effect. It would have been much better to have obtained the necessary information by scouts. It seriously alarmed McClellan for his rear, but for it the probabilities are that he would never have given the subject any thought, and he would certainly not have been prepared with a fleet of loaded transports on hand when he was, soon after, forced to change his base to Harrison's Landing on the James River. It is hard to estimate the difference in the result, had McClellan been taken by surprise on this occasion and been forced, perhaps, to retreat down the peninsula. On the whole, therefore, the éclat of our brilliant raid cost us much more than its results were worth. Where important strategy is on foot, too great care can scarcely be used to avoid making any such powerful suggestions to the enemy as resulted in this case. It is interesting to note that the enemy got no intimations of what was going on until June 24th. On that day, a deserter from Jackson's force was brought in. After trying in vain to pass himself off as a Union prisoner, escaped from Jackson, he had told of Jackson's march and its supposed intent to attack McClellan's flank. McClellan wired the story to Stanton and also sent out 2 Negroes to go along the railroad and investigate, but Stuart's pickets were too vigilant for the Negroes to pass them. Stanton gave some credence to the deserter's story, but it cut small figure among the rumours which McClellan was receiving from his detective bureau. He believed that Beauregard had arrived and that Lee now had 200,000 men. On June 25th, he made his first forward movement by advancing the skirmish lines of several brigades and taking up a portion of the neutral ground in front of our picket lines near the Williamsburg Road. Sharp skirmishing ensued and lasted all day, the Federal losses being reported as about 700, and our own about 400. The affair was called Orchard or Oak Grove Skirmish. Before issuing Order of Battle No. 75, Lee had had on June 23rd Longstreet, A.P. Hill, D.H. Hill, and Jackson to meet in conference at his headquarters to arrange all details. Longstreet had asked Jackson to fix the date on which the attack should be made. The latter named June 25th. Longstreet suggested that he allow more time, and the 26th was agreed to. When summoned to this meeting by Lee on Saturday, June 21st, Jackson was near Gordonsville. He started on a freight train bound to Richmond, but left the train before midnight that night at a station where he spent Sunday, attending church twice. At midnight he set out on horseback for the conference at Richmond, about 50 miles away, arriving about 3 p.m. Had he kept on the freight train to Richmond, he would have arrived early Sunday morning. His brigades on the march also kept Sunday in camp. It was usually the general's custom to keep account of Sundays spent in fighting or marching, and to make up for each by a weekday rest and sermons at the earliest opportunity. On the march from Gordonsville, the railroad was utilized for the infantry, as far as could be done, by picking up the rear brigades and carrying them forward. Artillery and cavalry marched all the way. On Tuesday morning, June 24th, Jackson's infantry was at Beaver Dam Station on the Virginia Central Road, about 18 miles from Ashland, where they were expected to encamp that night, and about 25 miles from the Virginia Central RR near the Stark Church, whence Order Number 75 required Jackson to march at 3 a.m. Thursday, June 26th. We now enter upon the story of performances. The orders governing the beginning of the action were simple and explicit. Every officer must have realized the supreme importance of time, even without the hint given by Lee in his order fixing the hour of Jackson's march at 3 a.m. It is therefore a great surprise to see that instead of crossing the Virginia Central RR at 3 a.m. on the 26th, they do not begin to cross it until 10 a.m. on that date. That is practically a whole day late because, with the distance still to be traversed, it will be too late to commence the great battle intended, in time to win it and gather the fruits of victory. Had Jackson pushed his march to Ashland on the night of the 24th, about 18 miles from Beaver Dam, as Lee's order contemplated, he would have had only 6 miles to march on the 25th, and his men would have been in excellent condition to set out at 3 a.m. on the 26th, with less than 10 miles to go to reach the enemy. The result of crossing the Central RR at 10 a.m. was to fight the battle a day late, and at Gaines' Mill, 3 miles nearer McClellan's main army, thus losing the opportunity to cut off Porter's corps at Beaver Dam. This opportunity, the cream of the whole campaign, was lost by Jackson's not demanding of his troops better marching on the 24th and 25th. His biographers have found many excuses for him, but, however good or bad these excuses may be, they will not be dwelt upon here for 2 reasons. First, the object of the narrative is neither praise nor blame, but only that military students may realize, more fully than they could without such an example, the infinite value of hours when a battle is on foot, and how easily hours may be lost. Second, the excuses of the biographers will best be given after finishing the whole story. For unfortunately, this loss of the first day is not the only, nor is it the worst, failure of Jackson during these 7 days to come to time as was expected of him. He nowhere, even distantly, approached his record as a soldier won in his every other battle, either before or afterward. As one reads of his weak and dilatory performance day after day, and recalls what he had always been before and always was afterward, one feels that during these 7 days he was really not Jackson. He was a different individual. He was under a spell. Nothing that he had to do was done with the vigour which marked all the rest of his career. Crossing the Central RR at 10 a.m. on the 26th, he marched but 8 miles farther that day, going into bivouac about 5 o'clock at Hundley's Corner. He was here in easy reach of Porter's rear, and in full hearing of the heavy cannonading and musketry going on at Mechanicsville, which will be told of presently.